Welcome to this deep dive into the wisdom of Naval Ravikant. You've sent in a really interesting collection of Naval's thoughts, his tweets, blog posts, even some podcast interviews. It seems like you're particularly keen on getting a handle on his ideas about building wealth, finding happiness, and making smart choices.
Right. Absolutely. It's quite a mix, but there's a common thread through a lot of Naval's thinking. The idea of playing long-term games, particularly with long-term people. He sees this as essential not just for financial success, but for a fulfilling life in general.
I like that. It's not just about quick wins, it's about building something sustainable, which is probably why so many people are drawn to his perspective on wealth creation. He has a way of cutting through the noise and getting to the core principles. Where should we start with that?
Well, Naval is quick to point out that most people misunderstand what wealth really is. They chase money or status, but those are fleeting. Real wealth, according to Naval, is about owning assets that generate income, even while you sleep. He often talks about building businesses that work for you rather than you working for them.
So it's not about being rich in the traditional sense. It's about having financial freedom. But how do you actually build those kinds of assets? Naval's idea of specific knowledge seems key here, but it's a term that gets thrown around a lot. What does it really mean in practical terms?
It's fascinating, isn't it? Specific knowledge is something you can't just learn from a course or a textbook. It's about finding that sweet spot where your natural talents and genuine curiosity intersect. It's the kind of knowledge that emerges when you're so engrossed in a subject that you lose track of time. Think of an athlete who has a natural ability but then spends years honing their skills through dedicated practice. That deep understanding they develop is specific knowledge.
So it's almost like an expertise born from passion.
Yeah.
But it's not just about being good at something, is it? Naval also talks a lot about leverage. How does that fit into the equation?
Leverage is how you multiply the impact of your specific knowledge. It allows you to create outsized results without linearly increasing your effort. Naval identifies several forms of leverage: capital, labor, code, and media.
Okay, let's break those down. Capital is pretty straightforward. Investing money to make more money. But Naval seems to suggest it's not just about having money. It's about using it wisely.
Exactly. Judgment becomes incredibly important when it comes to capital allocation. You need to understand where to deploy your resources to get the best returns. Think of venture capitalists. They're not just handing out money. They're carefully evaluating opportunities and betting on those with the highest potential for growth.
Then there's labor leverage. Hiring people to work for you. That's the classic way of scaling a business, right?
Yes, but Naval points out that traditional labor leverage can be tricky. You often end up trading your time for someone else's, which limits your freedom and your earning potential.
It's like you become the bottleneck in your own business,
hmm
which is why he's so interested in these newer forms of leverage, code, and media.
Exactly. These are what he calls permissionless leverage. You don't need anyone's permission to write code or create content. Think of a software developer who builds an app that millions of people use. They've leveraged code to reach a massive audience without needing to manage a huge team. Or consider a writer who self-publishes a book that becomes a bestseller. That's leveraging media to build a platform and create impact.
It's about creating something that can scale exponentially without you having to be directly involved at every step. And those examples highlight something else that Naval emphasizes: accountability. Why is that so important?
Naval believes that accountability is essential for building credibility and attracting opportunities. When you put your name on your work, you're signaling that you're willing to stand behind it, to be judged by its quality.
It shows that you're not afraid to take ownership, even if it means facing potential criticism. I've noticed that Naval himself is very transparent about his successes and failures. He seems to believe that sharing your journey, even the bumps along the way, is a powerful way to connect with people and build trust.
And that brings us back to his idea of playing long-term games with long-term people. Accountability is the foundation for those kinds of relationships. It demonstrates integrity and builds a reputation for being someone who can be relied upon.
It's like that saying, your reputation precedes you. If you're known for being accountable and trustworthy, it opens doors and creates opportunities that wouldn't be available otherwise.
Precisely. And that segues perfectly into the next part of our dive, happiness, because Naval believes that building genuine wealth is about more than just accumulating assets. It's about creating a life of meaning and fulfillment.
And if I remember correctly, his approach to happiness is just as unconventional as his approach to wealth creation. We'll dive into that right after a quick break.
So much of what we think about happiness is framed around external achievements, but Naval has a different perspective, doesn't he?
He really does. It's almost like he flips the script on how we typically view happiness. instead of seeing it as something we chase after he frames it as a skill we develop, something we can cultivate through practice and self-awareness.
And it starts with recognizing that a lot of our unhappiness comes from within, from our own desires constantly bumping up against reality. We want things to be different than they are, and that creates a lot of internal friction.
It reminds me of that saying, pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. It's about learning to accept the things we can't change, rather than fighting against them.
Exactly. And this is where Naval brings in the idea of mindfulness. It's about training our minds to be fully present in the moment, without judgment. It's not about emptying our minds of thoughts, but observing those thoughts and feelings without getting swept away by them.
So instead of dwelling on the past or worrying about the future, we learn to appreciate what is right in front of us. But that sounds easier said than done. Our minds are constantly jumping from one thought to the next. It's like trying to tame a wild monkey.
It does take practice, doesn't it? That's why Naval advocates for practices like meditation. He sees it as a way to debug our minds, to become more aware of our thought patterns and develop a sense of inner stillness.
He even calls it intermittent fasting for the mind. I love that analogy. Just like we give our bodies a break from digesting food, we need to give our minds a break from constant stimulation.
And by creating that space, we can access a deeper level of peace and clarity, which leads to another key point Naval makes about happiness: the distinction between internal and external validation.
Right, we've all been there, chasing external markers of success, the promotions, the possessions, the social media likes. But Naval suggests that true happiness comes from a different place entirely.
He argues that seeking happiness through external validation is a losing game. It's like running on a treadmill. You're always striving for the next thing, but never quite arriving at lasting contentment, because there's always going to be another goal to achieve, another person to impress. It's a never-ending cycle.
And it takes the focus away from what truly matters, cultivating a sense of self-worth and contentment that comes from within. That reminds me of another one of Naval's ideas, letting go of shoulds.
It's so liberating, isn't it? He suggests that shoulds often reflect societal expectations or guilt rather than our authentic desires. They keep us trapped in a cycle of obligation and comparison, preventing us from pursuing what truly brings us joy.
It's like that feeling of always trying to live up to someone else's standards instead of defining what success and fulfillment mean to us. And of course, there's envy, which Naval identifies as another major happiness killer. It's so easy to get caught in that trap of comparing ourselves to others, especially in a world where everyone is constantly showcasing their highlight reels.
It's insidious, isn't it? Envy breeds discontentment and keeps us focused on what we lack rather than appreciating what we have. Naval encourages us to break free from that comparison game and focus on our own unique path, to celebrate our own wins and appreciate the successes of others without letting it diminish our own sense of self-worth.
It all comes back to that idea of cultivating inner peace and contentment, rather than seeking validation from external sources. It's about playing the long game with ourselves, investing in our own well-being and creating a foundation for lasting happiness. And it strikes me that this inward focus is actually essential for making good decisions as well. After all, if you're constantly seeking external validation, it's going to cloud your judgment.
That's such an important point, and it leads perfectly into the final part of our dive. Decision-making Naval has some really interesting ideas about how to hone our judgment and make choices that lead to both success and fulfillment.
That's what I'm really looking forward to unpacking. Let's dive into Naval's approach to making those tough decisions. All right, let's jump right into it. Naval's approach to decision-making. It seems like he places a lot of emphasis on something he calls judgment.
He does. It's almost like he sees judgment as this master skill, especially in today's world where one good decision can really make all the difference.
I can see that, but judgment, it feels kind of intangible. How do you actually get better at it?
Well, Naval believes that good judgment isn't something you're just born with. You cultivate it over time through experiences, through making mistakes, learning from them. It's about really observing the world, understanding cause and effect, and developing this intuition for what's likely to work and what's likely to, not work out so well.
So it's less about following some set formula, more about developing this deep understanding of how things actually work in the real world.
Exactly. And that's where those mental models that we talked about earlier come in handy.
Right, those frameworks for thinking that can help us make sense of complex situations and make better decisions.
Exactly. They help us avoid those common pitfalls that we might fall into if we're not careful. Naval is a big fan of borrowing mental models from all sorts of different fields, physics, economics, even history.
I remember him talking about the power of inversion. Like instead of asking, how do I achieve this? You ask, how do I avoid the opposite?
It's a really powerful way to think about problems. It forces you to consider potential downsides that you might otherwise miss.
Like if you're trying to build a successful business, don't just focus on what makes businesses succeed. Study what causes them to fail.
Exactly. You learn a lot more from failures than from successes.
And it reminds me of another mental model that Naval often talks about, the idea of embracing complexity. He's really honest about the limits of our knowledge and the importance of accepting uncertainty.
Right. He's all about probabilistic thinking, accepting that we can't predict the future with 100% certainty, but we can use the information we have to make the best possible bets.
Exactly. So it's not about being paralyzed by indecision. It's about making a decision with the understanding that you might be wrong and being okay with that.
Being willing to adjust course if necessary. Speaking of making decisions, I know Naval has a few of his own personal heuristics that he uses.
Oh, yeah, he does.
I'm thinking of that one. The if you can't decide, the answer is no rule.
Ah, yes. That one, it's a bit counterintuitive at first, isn't it? Why say no when you're unsure?
Yeah, it seems like you'd want to keep your options open. Well, the thing is, in a world that's full of choices, saying yes to everything can actually lead to overwhelm and distraction.
Right. You spread yourself too thin.
Exactly. So this heuristic, it helps you conserve your energy and your time. Make sure you only commit to the things that you're really genuinely excited about.
Makes you more discerning. And then there's the run-uphill heuristic, which is even more counterintuitive.
Oh, yeah. That one's a good one. So when faced with two equally appealing options, Naval suggests choosing the one that's harder in the short term.
Right. Deliberately choosing the more challenging path.
Exactly. Because often the harder path leads to much greater rewards down the line. It builds resilience, it develops character, and it pushes you beyond your comfort zone.
It's about seeing challenges as opportunities for growth, which I think ties in beautifully with his overall philosophy of playing long-term games, not just in business, but in all aspects of life.
Absolutely. It's about investing in yourself and your future, even if the payoff isn't immediately apparent.
And that brings us back to his idea of playing long-term games with long-term people, building those deep, meaningful relationships that can support and challenge us.
Right. It's not about those transactional relationships. It's about finding those people who share your values, who you can learn from, grow with.
And I think that's really the heart of Naval's message. It's about focusing on the things that truly matter, building a life of wealth and fulfillment on your own terms.
And recognizing that it's a journey, not a destination. There's no finish line. It's about constantly learning, growing, and evolving.
And finding joy in the process.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up this deep dive into the wisdom of Naval Ravikant. It's been a fascinating conversation full of insights, and I hope our listeners have found it just as thought-provoking as we have.
Me too.